and we're PhD students who both lived, worked and studied in Cambridge, hence our coming together for this project. Alina is at the University of Cambridge, researching South Asian artists in Britain in the 1980s, and I'm at the University of St Andrews, researching lesbian feminist photography and film in 1980s Britain. So we initiated the Radical Art in Cambridge research project in March this year, which sets out to explore the lost history of experimental arts activity in Cambridge in the 1970s to 1990s. So far, we've been fundraising for the project and conducting archival research and interviews. This is our first public-facing event, which we're hoping to follow up with archive workshops at Cambridge Central Library and Kettles Yard. We're actually passing around a form this evening where you can add your contact details if you'd like to attend future events. So we'd like to start by thanking our speakers, Pavel Buchler, Simon Cutts, Ian Hunt, Mark Lumley and Sharon Kivland, as well as some others who've supported our research and this event so far, including Tobin, Hilary Gresty, Claire MacDonald, Brian Human, Roy Hammonds, Pete DeBola and Evelyn Horrell Campbell. Thanks to Kettles Yard, especially Andrew Nairn, Susie Biller, Helen Dickman, Tom Noblet, Eliza Spindell and Habza Rashid. Thanks to Marika Lopez-Diaz and Jen Pollard in Faculty of English 2. And thanks to archivists Tom Davies and Ruth Long. And thanks especially today to Kathy and Sophie for running our tech this afternoon. This event is supported by the British Art Network, a subject specialist network supported by Tate and the Paul Mellon Centre for Studies in British Art. So in terms of the outline of this event, we're going to start by giving a brief introduction to the 1980s Cambridge art scene. And then we're going to hand over to Ian to chair the panel before having a short break for 5 minutes or 10 minutes, and then return to audience questions at the end.
Okay, so to start with an introduction for some context. So the key sites in the 1980s Cambridge art scene were Kettles Yard, St Matthew's Photo Workshop in the late 70s, the Cambridge Darkroom, and artist and filmmaker residencies in the university colleges. These activities also ran in conjunction with activities like the Cambridge International Poetry Festival and important work happening at the Women's Art Collection at New College, now Murray Edwards College. So to begin with Kettles Yard, in 1983, Hilary Gresty took over as curator, supported by assistant curators and education officers, including Andrew Nairn, who's with us this evening. So like Gresty's predecessors, she had to confront the question of how Kettles Yard would operate after the founders Jim and Helen Eade had relocated to Edinburgh in 1973. Having made Kettles Yard, as Jimmy described it, a living place for art for over 16 years. In Gresty's own words, she was grappling with the question, how do you keep it alive and make it relevant without destroying it? One of Gresty's priorities was to provide opportunities outside London for young contemporary artists. She initiated an artist residency scheme in 1984, which was funded by the Regional Division of the Arts Council, Eastern Arts, and also by the Cambridge colleges. This brought in artists including Gruber Mystery, Mary Kelly, and Veronica Ryan, who did a residency with Kettles Yard and Jesus College in 1987, during which she worked in a studio in Newnham. She gave Kettles Yard a work called Territories, which is actually now on loan to the English faculty and hangs in this building. Other exhibitions and workshops from this time included Sharon Kivland's exhibition Conversion of Pleasure into Sickness in 1987, and the group show Dislocations in 1987 to 88, selected by Veronica Ryan, which included Monica Toom's performance Matters of Gravity, and photography workshops by Zarina Vinci at local schools in Cambridge. This reflects Gresty's mission to take work outside the Kettles Yard gallery and into the community. And you can find out more about this period at Kettles Yard on the Oral Histories page of the Kettles Yard website and in a chapter by Gresty in British Art of the Long 1980s, published in Bloomsbury in 2020.
So on the other side of the city was the Cambridge Darkroom. The Darkroom emerged out of the St Andrews Photo Workshop, founded in the St Matthews area around Mill Road in 1978 by 6 local photographers, including Roy Hammonds and Brian Heumann, who's here today. Their aims were to document social life in St Matthews, to cultivate interest in photography in the area, and to archive old photos of the locality. Their activities included a Photograph Yourself Day, in which locals were encouraged to come into a makeshift studio and produce a self-portrait with a preset camera and lighting rig. These images were displayed in the group's first exhibition, Exposures, at the Cambridge Municipal Library in Lion Yard in 1979. This project contributed to the broader community photography movement in 1970s Britain, whereby photography became a means of working class self-representation. In 1980, the St Matthews Photo Workshop were formed as the Cambridge Darkroom, setting up a community darkroom in the old boiler room of the Bathhouse Neighbourhood Centre on Gwyder Street. In 1982, the Darkroom secured funding from Eastern Arts and Cambridge City Council to establish a permanent photography centre in the Old Dales Brewery building on Gwyder Street, which crucially included a gallery space. It also hired staff rather than relying on volunteers. Mark Lumley became the director, and Pavel Buchler was the exhibitions officer. He designed the logo, publications, and promotional materials. Note that the Darkroom coincided with the redevelopment of St Matthews, which at the time was a neglected former residential area for railway workers. And also this group had connections to the local authority through Brian Heumann, who was a town planner. Over time, Cambridge Darkroom garnered a reputation in Cambridge and beyond. It held its own temporary and touring exhibitions, joint exhibitions with Kettles Yard, darkroom and photography workshops, talks, and film and video screenings. Its exhibitions were significant, such as one, the Marxist feminist photographer Jo Spence's first ever retrospective in 1985. The Darkroom paralleled the efforts of independent photography galleries across the UK to establish photography as a fine art movement, one worthy of gallery space. You can find out more about the St Matthews Photo Workshop and the Cambridge Darkroom on Roy's fantastic websites, The Golden Fleece, and the article Disseminating a Practice, 5 Years of the Cambridge Darkroom, in the October 1989 issue of Creative Camera. Other artistic happenings around these two prominent spaces included the King's College Artists Residency Scheme and other Cambridge College initiatives, including studio hire, exhibitions, workshops, and art teaching for students. Laura Mulvey applied to filmmaker in residence post at King's in 1978. Additionally, Coracle set up a bookshop for a short period in the Kettles Yard entrance, collaborating with artist Paul Lincoln, who lived and worked in the space too.
So we're really delighted to have 5 speakers with us today to give an account of this period and to explore some critical questions. And each speaker was involved in activities with Kettles Yard, the Cambridge Darkroom, and Coracle during the 1980s. So to just end with some bios, Dr. Sharon Kivland is a visual artist and writer working in London and France. Sharon is a reader in fine art at Sheffield Hallam University and research associate at the Centre for Freudian Analysis and Research in London. Sharon has exhibited her work widely in the UK and North America, including at Kettles Kettles Yard and the Cambridge Darkroom between 1984 to 1988. Mark Lumley is a photographer and architect who photographed the Cambridge International Poetry Festival in 1983 and was co-director of the Cambridge Darkroom from 1984 to 89. He's a member of the architecture practice Archetype, which is a leader in passive house design, and he's worked especially on school design. Professor Pavel Buchler is a visual artist, critic, and curator working in the UK. Pavel is Emeritus Professor in Fine Art at Manchester School of Art and was co-director at the Cambridge Darkroom from 1984. Simon Kurtz is a writer, artist, designer, and publisher. He founded Coracle in London in the mid-1970s and was involved in the implementation of the Coracle residency at Kettles Yard in 1985 to 86. And Ian Hunt, our chair, studied English at Girton College, Cambridge after a foundation year at art school in the early 1980s. He worked as a volunteer at Kettles Yard, co-organising events with the Student Association and helping out at the Coracle Bookshop. He has since worked as a bookseller, art critic and editor. He has also run a small poetry press, Alfred David Editions, and his own poems are published as Green Light by Bark Press. He teaches critical studies in the Department of Art at Goldsmiths, University of London. So sincere thanks to you all for coming and speaking to us today, and thanks again to everyone in the audience for coming. So without further ado, over to you, Ian.
Thanks everyone for coming. I hope you can hear me okay with my beak on. I'm delighted to be able to take part in this event. I saw some of this period through the eyes of a student, and Cambridge is a very weird place socially because of the mixture of tides of students coming in and out and the town itself that stays through it. And I hope that some of the mixed social character of the city in that period can emerge from some of the detail of the, especially the story of the Darkroom, which I think with Mark and Pavel here tonight, we can hopefully map out some of that history of the Darkroom, which really made a huge impact and in its move from social forms of photography towards the promotion of photography as an art. So just going to begin with asking all the speakers to talk about their involvement in the experimental art scene, in radical art in Cambridge, as we've been given this title, Radical Art in Cambridge, without a question mark, as though it was there, which is, but I might just ask Mark to start to say something.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I got interested in photography and I did a couple of courses. One of them was with David Hearn in Newport, and it involved learning about documentary photography and photojournalism. And this, having completed this course, I returned to Cambridge and I became aware of the St Matthew's workshop and got to know Brian and Roy. And we started to kind of work, I think I worked with you on kind of programs of developing kind of accessibility for the Darkroom facility, which had been very effectively built by Roy and Brian and others. And it was, at that point, it was really about kind of promoting photography as a kind of an accessible, an expressive kind of medium. And an example of one of the things that we did was got asked to work with young offenders. And it was a very powerful kind of medium to give a young person a camera, to encourage writing, to kind of bring out sort of stories and things like this. So we developed a kind of an early kind of social kind of agenda for the facility. And I think one of the most poignant moments actually at this time was when we had a visit from Barry Lane, who was then the arts photography officer for the Arts Council of Great Britain, and he was kind of visiting different venues in the country, and he said, "This is great, doing good stuff here, but where are you going to go with this, and what are your frustrations?" And I said, "Well, the main frustration is that we don't have a gallery, and he said, "Well, why not?" And I said, "Well, I don't know, we just haven't got, at that time, Dale's Brewery was across the road, it's an empty building. And I said, well, actually, we're kind of looking at this building. And he said, well, get on with it then. Come on, get on with it. Do something about it, which is really a great shove, really. And we, at that point, I think we started with Brian and Roy, and we started to kind of look for funding possibilities and ways that we might start to make this happen. And very conveniently around this time, I was around the corner photographing Alice Roughton, who was a very famous figure early when we studied medicine in Cambridge. Had this remarkable house with open door with about 40 people living in it. And she said, "You must stay for lunch." And as I did, these odd characters started to emerge from the woodwork and sit around this massive table. One of those characters was Pavel, I think, who had just been extricated from Czechoslovakia as a political refugee, and started to talk about his skills as a designer and typographer and artist. And so he was co-opted as our, at that point, designer, and that's the start of a very powerful journey towards developing the proposal and winning funding and getting the facility going.
Yeah.
I don't know if you remember that part, that first meeting.
Very much so, yeah.
And maybe if you could say something about your early involvement with the Darkroom. I remember you in this period as a strange man on a butcher's bike who had a strong reputation as a designer. I had no idea that you were an artist in this period, and so tell us about your involvement with the Darkroom.
Yeah, well, I can pick it up exactly where Mark kind of left it. I was at that time staying literally around the corner from here at 9 Adams Road, as Mark pointed out, in this very strange household full of very strange people, and met Mark there, and almost like on the spot, Mark sort of proposed that I get engaged with this sort of then new project. And almost the first thing we did, aside from me sort of designing some logo or something, was that we got into Mark's really battered Renault van and went for this tour of all the photography galleries that we could find on the map, armed with nothing but a hip flask of whiskey, I remember. And so we visited all these places, and as we were sort of talking to those people, how do you run a photography gallery, what's your program, where do you get the money from, what's the sort of, profile of the program and so on. We kind of gradually, it was all incredibly naive, I think. We were incredibly naive. And we sort of felt, not that we can do better, but that we can do something slightly different, that all these galleries sounded exactly the same. They were identical. They even all used the identical frames. And so we kind of felt, well, we can do something maybe slightly better. And terribly naively, we started with this really wide sort of spread of what photography may be, where we, once we built the gallery designed by Colin Lumley over there, we sat down and wrote this invitation letter to everybody, every photographer, everybody who had a camera actually, and we could get hold of their addresses. Everybody from rather sort of important senior famous fashion photographers to Sharon over there. I still have that picture from the first show. It was called Autographs, where just a kind of register, who is who, everybody represented by one picture. Terribly naive project, and we got some kind of little bit of criticism for it, that it doesn't really have any integrity, that it's a sort of complete mess. But in some sense, that mess was kind of our trademark, really, for the next few years. We sort of never really quite confined ourselves to just one thing. And it is an interesting thing that you pointed out, that it was a period of a sort of transition on the visual arts scene for photography, from being the medium of social documentation to being kind of perhaps more promoted and accepted as an art form, or as a new art form. It was a period of interesting kind of somewhat split discussion in the sort of critical world between, let's say, the sort of position represented by magazines like 10/8, where photography was a social documentary tool and had nothing or very little to do with the tradition of visual art, to things that began to emerge in galleries that were not specifically focused on photography, but started showing work of artists using exclusively that medium or some kind of progenies of that medium, like film and video and so on. And so we tried, like I said, without actually any sort of real program or without formulating any real program or any real program position, we tried to kind of show and promote and introduce to the relatively small audiences that we initially had here in Cambridge anything that we thought was good. Whatever was good, whatever we thought was interesting, we would kind of consider and we would show it. I'm really rather proud of some of the things that sort of emerged in the process. And so we had a very pacey program of exhibitions. Like Mark, I armed myself with my prompt cards. Actually, in the original folder here, you can see with Mark's scribbles here, I tried to decipher in Mark, you will have to help me with it, what it was.
Oh gosh.
It's something to do with £7,500
40-year-old
funding
scribble.
you were trying to get out of someone. Anyway, and
it was a very pacey program, wasn't it?
I just noticed at one point behind us there was this, among other things, this is one of the program leaflets we published. It covers a period of less than 3 months and includes 4 exhibitions, 7 screenings of experimental film talks and so on. And it was quite, now I'm really astonished.
I think it was ridiculously pacey. It was very pacey.
It was really incredible.
Yeah.
And it was back to back. You may have an exhibition, perhaps a small exhibition on the gallery stairway, of a little documentary project from a workshop at a school, for instance. Next, as was already mentioned here, let's say Joe Spence, and in the middle of it, you may have screenings of 10 kind of completely sort of up-to-date experimental film that nobody else was really doing, and so on.
I'm just going to bring in Sharon here as someone whose work I first saw at the Darkroom in a group exhibition, I think, and in a way, for the audience for the younger members of the audience to just, reflect that Cambridge was absolutely starved of any art infrastructure at this point. Kettles Yard which obviously has been mentioned, was going through a very important stage under Hilary Gresti, whose exhibitions were, extraordinarily inventive in pushing what was possible within the frames of the University Gallery at that time. But I think the Darkroom had this much more open brief, and there was a place there that you could see art of many different types, and also that was open to the some of the continuing energies of the 70s in terms of thinking more broadly about art and medium, and to think about those media that were more available to feminism, more available to social thinking and experimental thinking. So I wondered how did you get involved in the Darkroom, and how did you perceive Cambridge coming to it and exhibiting there?
I have to admit I've been dreading this moment, particularly on the train, then that feeling intensified on the bus, which was diverted. To think how one approaches, what kind of questions would be asked, and would I have anything to say when I couldn't remember most of these years at all. And in fact, an email came yesterday from Eve Lomax saying, I see you're doing this. She thought, I can just remember we drank an awful lot, didn't we? And another email came from someone wishing me luck with it, saying how he had learnt a lot, and I couldn't even remember who he was. So then I did remember, actually, and I couldn't think what he could have possibly learnt from me. I think there's a problem always for me in trying to reconstruct the past as a series of movements or radical moments, because at the time, you have very little idea of what you're involved in, whether you're in an exhibition or in the street in a demonstration. Something has brought you there and you're thinking about it, but you don't think historically. You know, even as a good Marxist, you're not doing your dialectical thinking at that moment. So where am I going with this? I expect you're wondering that too. I didn't even remember the autograph show. I'm horrified that you have a work from that period of mine.
I paid for it, I bought it.
I'm even more horrified that you paid for it with good money. Because when the slide came up with the work, I thought, oh my God, I never want to see that work ever again.
It's beautiful.
It isn't, it's terrible work, I think. So even I have to confront myself by going back into the past. But I think what was happening, I'm going to take a risk in this because I know it's not true what I'm going to say, okay? So but bear with me. I think there felt as though at that moment there was an opening and a movement between ways of thinking and looking at photographic imagery and other images, and that a vague floating population, a constellation of people clustered in everything. Now that's happened before. You can think about the London Filmmakers Co-op or other movements that preceded. And that's why I'm so reluctant to make any claim for this moment as being a moment different. But perhaps each of those moments, historically, adds to a different narrative. I'm going to stop there because I think you should hand to Simon.
Yeah. So,
but I will come back.
Yeah. So, Simon, could I just ask you to say a bit about coming to open the bookshop at Kettles Yard and your experiences then?
Sure, absolutely. As usual, I'm the imposter here, I think. Sort of fell into the scene in a kind of marquee kind of way. Hilary Cresty, I was travelling through from London to Norfolk or something and called in Kettles Yard, and Hilary Cresty said, would you like to open a bookshop here in this new foyer that we're building coming from Northampton Street? So I said, well, it's kind of an interesting idea. Let me go away and think about it. And Coracle had done quite a lot of bookshop interventions in different exhibitions we'd made. I mean, we always saw the bookshop as an absolutely prime case of how you access books, how you find out what they are. You know, you can only buy from Amazon now if you know what the book is, really, more or less. You need to delve and play around in the bookshop to find out what's going on. So we built the bookshop over the summer of 1985 and continued with it till perhaps the end of that year, maybe into January of 86, I think, maybe. The kind of financial situation didn't really stack up in one way because the university, as I'm sure it's not changed very much, was really interested in getting an increasing rent from us in some way, you know. I think also a room became available above the bookshop, which we were asked if we'd like to occupy at rent, of course, you know. And we took over this room. And I think the powers that be thought it was going to be more bookshop, but in fact we installed an artist, inventor friend, Paul Lincoln, who built this remarkable allegorical machine called In Praise of Madame de Pompadour and the Court of Louis XV. And over about 3 months, this machine was constructed and caused an amazing amount of interest. There's a German TV film about it, which has gone missing, but there was a film made for German television. And Paul's way of working is very involving. Anyone who stepped into the room when he would be working would be pulled into the mechanism in some way, and he would explain how parts of this thing worked, you know. But it was a very silent, unprogrammed kind of event, really. A kind of residency without any application, or even before residencies began, but maybe Hilary had done residencies in '84 in Kettles Yard, I didn't know that. And the bookshop was really a front of house bookshop for the gallery, and it worked as such. But I think it had dimensions that were not expected, like very strong literary presence of contemporary poetry and American poetry especially, I think, really. And there was always going through these Coracle ventures with bookshops, an idealized sense of what the bookshop could be, a little bit like I've explained, but more detailedly. And it kind of, those bookshops all model themselves on, perhaps, first of all, Ulysses Carrion's bookshop in Amsterdam, Other Books and So, Printed Matter in New York, which still goes to this day, Bookie Wookie in Amsterdam, which still goes to this day. These are powerful tools and they need to be apprehended in some way, you know. And the sort of tap bookshops you've got in all our big institutions are just a travesty. Tate Gallery, Royal Academy, I mean, they're just apron and bag sort of shops, really, aren't they? I mean, so, I mean, that challenge of the idealized bookshop still goes on, I think, in the heads of many of the people who work there. The bookshop came to a close, as I say, at the beginning of '86, because I think the rent went up in some way that we couldn't sustain. I mean, Coracle's always had this kind of quasi-collective spirit of working when we work with other people, and some of that was perhaps difficult to justify in a way. And there were much more silent times in a way as well, you know, I mean, there was far less interest in art in some way. I mean, the 70s was the high point of indifference to art, which was a good time. In a way, you could do anything. And I think in a way, we were still living in that spirit in the mid-1980s too. One could say much more about that, but maybe later. Yeah, I mean, that's a small picture. I'll hand this back to Ian.
Well, just apropos your remark, Sharon, that it wasn't really a kind of a special moment, but rather a kind of accumulation of perhaps things that sort of happened in various places. I would agree with that when it comes to the kind of presence of photography within the art galleries and the art scene. Although it was actually you who told me, I think on our first encounter, you described yourself and, you know, likes of you, artists who work with photography as the corridor people, as people who are shown in the corridors of the galleries. You know, so there was something kind of that sort of we did, that we helped to perhaps shift sort of, you know, the things from the corridor into the kind of main space of the gallery. But what I really wanted to say is that perhaps the moment wasn't special, but the place in a sense was. You know, the fact that it was in Cambridge. It was the right time, in other words, the wrong place. But the fact that it was the wrong place, in a way, helped us in some kind of way because of our sort of naivety and not just even thinking about it was the wrong place. I remember very vividly, right at the beginning, after the tour of the photography galleries in Mark's rusty Renault 1 with the big flask of whiskey, how I went to see Bill Buchler, who was then the director of ICA in London. Just a kind of, I can't remember exactly what it was that we wanted from them or to do with them or whatever. We decided actually a slight, you know, note sort of, or a slight detour. We decided quite early on that we were going to try and work, collaborate, exchange exhibition and so on, not just with the photography galleries, which seem to be kind of swapping things among themselves, but actually we worked with the Serpentine Gallery, with John Hansard Gallery, with Milton Keynes when it first opened and so on. So, you know, we kind of spread it more widely, and I can't remember what the purpose of my visit at ICA was, but I do remember it was right at the beginning, maybe even before the first exhibition. I remember him saying, this is not a serious project. Why? Because if it was serious, you wouldn't be doing it in Cambridge, you would be doing it in London, you know. And I just thought, you know, this is a nonsense, you know. Cambridge is a great place, you know. I came from what was then Czechoslovakia, you know. I kind of thought, this is a wonderful, you know, great sort of place. Anything is possible here. And I think that's where the kind of, you know, I wouldn't call it unique, perhaps. I wouldn't think that the Darkroom was unique, but it was really quite special. It was special because it was in the wrong place, you know. And sort of now in reflection, it makes a lot of sense.
I just want to sort of think about Coracle Press sponsoring Paul Lincoln as a unofficial artist in residence, virtually camping out in the upstairs gallery. This is sort of an artist in residence on the cheap, while the kind of official artist in residence schemes were starting up with the studio in Newnham, with Drew the Mystery and so on. And remembering that when these artists came here, they had very few people to talk to, and they latched onto them because, what the hell is Cambridge? They weren't massively supported by the colleges they were in or the town, and so the conversation was small and it was close. But I just really wanted to ask, or everyone maybe to sort of think about Cambridge as a place, and is it a place worth doing something or not? Is it a place that needs missionary work with artists in residence coming from elsewhere to spend time here and maybe sort of make some connections with the university, or is it actually a place with its own identity and its own culture that's outside of the university?
Yeah, I mean, I think St Matthew's workshop and grew out of a community base, and the Darkroom certainly was about a distinctive town identity, and it obviously it's incredibly beneficial growing that relationship with Hilary, and Hilary was incredibly open to us, and it was a great relationship that we grew and did a sequence of the open shows, and really phenomenal to kind of have that. But we were, sort of conscious. Well, we were based in the part of Cambridge, which was, traditionally we were just on the bridge at Mill Road, where students historically weren't allowed to cross because it's considered too dodgy to go that far out of town. But I think it's, it's just a. Yeah, it was for me, growing up in Cambridge, part of my time, it was very much about town identity, not anti-university, but just having something going on in the town. But I think just in relation to, Pavel was saying about the pace was quite phenomenal, and the kind of energy in general. I mean, we were hiring, we managed to fit into our not too huge gallery David Hockney's Arts Council touring exhibition, and actually his agent who hung it insisted David come and have a look at it. So Pavel and I had a drink with him in our local pubs. He said, "You've got to see it. It's looking good." So we were quite kind of open. We were really driving, to see, what's sort of finger on the pulse in terms of what's kind of happening. Continuing to kind of promote local work and have local workshops and activity, and putting in where we saw opportunities to bring other work to Cambridge. But I think the energy of the sort of the group shows, which Pavel was very significant in, was very significant in bringing in a sort of bigger group of what were then, I suppose, artists as well as photographers. But there was also what was interesting about the kind of confinement. It wasn't a tiny space. It's about, I think it's 40 by 40 feet square space. It used to be. The brewery used to flood the roof of it. It used to have 6 inches of cork on the walls. It's this, and these steel columns, kind of a very enclosed, very interior kind of space. But with our builder, we developed this quite clever device with screens where we could expand the showing kind of capacity. But what was kind of, so it's this very interior space, but we kind of had people who wanted to kind of challenge that space. So we started sort of cutting into it. We cut walls into walls, and we suspended, so we started to do installation, and, Ron Hazeltine, Sharon, created this great kind of piece, and, so we included film, we included through opening up to other medium, we had performance, experimental film. So it had a sort of, sort of naivety, but it had a kind of an energy and a kind of an inclusive, expansive kind of feel to it, and also I think able to recognise the value of somebody like Joe Spencer's significant kind of contribution to sort of more a more kind of political type of work where we were putting together shows that she's.
I'm so sorry to interrupt. I've got a bit of a problem with your mic and I don't want us to miss what you're saying. So it's this one here.
Okay.
Would you mind if I take it out of your pocket? Thank you. Sorry, everyone.
Sorry. I was just wondering, Sharon, if you could maybe reflect on your understanding of both the other galleries around within reach of Cambridge and beyond that were considerable examples in this period. Pavel's mentioned the galleries that you started doing exchanges with, like John Hansard and Milton Keynes and so on. But also, just again, for some of the younger members of the audience to understand, that the structure of education at this time produced very, very strong disciplinary boundaries, especially around photography. There's the worshippers of the medium, and there's a few art schools that have some notion of photography as entering a different kind of space through the 70s and into the 80s. So I wonder if you could maybe reflect on
Yes.
some of the other significant
that
galleries.
was relatively new, where people who were going to study photography wanted to do more than simply work in a dark room on paper and in a studio. And that wasn't caught up with or reflected in exhibition venues who were a little bit slow to pick up that, with the exception of perhaps Nigel Greenwood, with a very particular collection or interest. And again, trying to remember the timing. And that was when I came to camera work as its director for a 2-year period, and also had thinking of the porosity of exchanges, was able to work with the Darkroom.
Could you say a bit about? I wanted to.
Can
ask,
you just hold that? My earrings
Yeah.
come out of my ear.
I wanted to ask about camera work, as it's obviously maybe a quite significant comparison for what the Darkroom is.
Yes, I mean,
Yes, certainly.
because camera work was a very formal documentary photography gallery working in a very classical documentary tradition, with touring exhibitions that were laminated panels that would be distributed around libraries, community centres, and it was very worthwhile and very worthy, and finally a little bit dull.
But very influential in
God,
its
strike
time.
me down.
I mean, it was really powerful in what it.
Tell us where it was.
Well, yes.
I
yes, I want to say it was powerful, but it had actually largely lost its power.
Yeah.
But Sharon, say a bit more about the immediate social context of the gallery, who went there, where it was.
It was in the East End, in a fairly uncompromising building, and virtually no one from the local community went into it, because why would they? It was dull. Or they'd go and use the dark rooms, and so it was a lot of outreach work, going into schools, going into making workshops, bringing people in through that, working with groups. So there were the dark room, people who worked downstairs in the dark room, who hated everyone who worked upstairs in the gallery and the magazine. And eventually, like any institution, it just imploded. And I remember one funding meeting, where someone said, well, why don't you do a show about the struggle in the Labour Party? And Alan Hayden, who was then the GLC arts officer, and I kind of had to do that rapid turning away where you can't catch each other's eye, because it will end, because we would have laughed so much. But it wasn't that it was very hard to make changes. They were slow because there was still idea of what photography should be and who should see it. And that broke down much more quickly in Cambridge.
Yeah.
And I think also the relation between Cambridge Darkroom and Kettles Yard was crucial to that, and the actual movement, not just in thought, but physically between two spaces across a city through exhibitions that were shared. That was important.
It made a
how
really
you
critical
travel.
link, I think, yeah.
But
you're
also
right.
there was a lot of movement, you know, reminded me of that between actually East London, back road, where sort of everybody, we were showing lift somehow, you know, or a lot of people we were working with, and Cambridge. We used to have somebody called Chrissy Isles, who I suppose still is the curator of video at Whitney now. A London-based curator and a critic who would sort of hire a minibus and bring people here for perhaps not every opening at the Darkroom, but pretty much every opening, and that's where the kind of drinking was taking place afterwards, and the curry in, what was it called?
It was Maureen Paley as well. It's interim art.
Maureen Paley. They all lived in the same road there.
I live down the road from that now, just across the road from.
Oh, well, there, you know, it's a sort of circular sort of history. But what I wanted to say, actually, an interesting thing apropos what you said about the kind of Cambridge sort of identity. On the one hand, it was very much about Cambridge, and it was both in terms of facilitating some production and discussion of photographic work here, as it was about, well, import, if you like, cultural import into Cambridge. But in some sense, without, again, planning it or even being aware of it, I think the program became also a little bit of a springboard for certain type of photographic practice, that kind of corridor-based practice into the world.
Yeah.
You know, when you look at it, there were a number of, in later years, very visible, important artists in that field, ranging from Helen Chadwick from Beck Road, whose second ever exhibition was at the Darkroom, Olivier Richon, Karen Noor, even yourself, Sharon. And I think the Darkroom kind of indirectly somehow became a kind of a bit of a sort of springboard from that sort of distance of Cambridge suddenly.
But it also made a clustering, a constellation.
Yeah, but it sort of helped, if you like, not to quite launch the work into the world, even though...
Showpiece them. Roger Palmer,
going
to Serpentine, Craigie Horsfield, going to the ICA.
That was definitely our discovery.
Yeah.
And somehow, you know, the Darkroom itself couldn't have made it visible in the world. But perhaps it made it a little bit visible in East London, and from there it kind of, you know, people to kind of notice abroad and so on. So it had this weird, strange kind of, it was very much a Cambridge place, or a Cambridge thing.
And perhaps it's
But at the
something
same
that can
time-
only happen outside London.
Yes.
Because Sandra Drew in Canterbury was doing a very similar thing with sculpture and women, and particularly women artists.
Yeah.
And recently, Southwark Park Galleries made a retrospective of that period when Sandra was curating those shows. And Sandra would, I think, have kind of balked at being called a curator. She brought people together in her kitchen and was very good at raising funding. And in putting that show together, it was from the archive, existing works, but it was also finding what had happened to those women, who was still practicing, who had gone elsewhere, who had become a witch to people, who had left, who was not making art any longer. And so that's what happens also in the tracing of history, and where you put all the crossovers together.
Yeah.
Because some of those women artists would have also
Yeah.
been involved with you.
Yeah.
And I've got a sort of further question about some of the big group exhibitions and collaborations between the Darkroom and Kettles Yard. I want to ask, one was called Next Tomorrow, and a later one was called Death. And these were both quite large-scale open exhibitions. I think there was a submission process,
Yes.
possibly, for
Yes.
both of these
Yes.
exhibitions.
Yes.
And we,
And,
selectors appointed, yeah.
And so I think, but these thematic exhibitions that were by open submission, and the inclusion in them meant something, and once you were included, you were curated within a context that made the work collectively look really fascinating. And so I wonder if you could sort of speak about those large group exhibitions.
Yeah, there was one before called Sequences.
Sequences, yeah.
Which we did on our own. But already I remember at that time we were planning with Hilary the next one we'll do sort of jointly. And I think what was so interesting about, open exhibitions, they are always bit of a problem because they attract all kinds of terrible things, no? And but somehow there are a couple of things that seem to kind of stand out now from on reflection, from hindsight. One is that neither the death nor the next tomorrow. It's a nice poster here. Very beautiful, if I may say so.
You may.
I can't believe that I designed all these things on top of everything.
Can I just say, I
had to
think,
design
Pavel's, beginning with the logo that he did for the Darkroom, which is a sort of a square, but the consistency of the production of the private view cards, the posters, the pamphlets, the catalogues are incredible. I mean, they're beautiful. I just sort of I was trying to find some of mine the other day, and I hope I got them all. But they are a remarkable sort of trace of that and a record of that. But I think also they acted as a sort of an attractor. And gave us a sort of credibility.
But anyway, back to the collaboration there. I'm only sort of leaping in because I don't want to blush more than I already do. So the first thing was that while neither the second nor the third open exhibition were actually open exhibitions for photographers or to do with photography, they actually ended up being mainly photographic work. Because by that time, this is only about maybe 3 years into the history we are talking about, 3 or 4 years. The presence of photographic work in the fine art galleries has already kind of, changed. There already was quite a lot of it then. And somehow, if it is done across these two galleries, and we did not really decided that, or as a rule, that if it is a painting, and there weren't many, it has to be at Kettles Yard, and if it is a photograph, it goes to the Darkroom. No, it just ended up. So that's one kind of actually quite remarkable thing. The second remarkable thing is just the kind of quality of the people who were interested and who sort of submitted work. It was an open exhibition, but many of the people who sent in work or applied for it, and there weren't really kind of hundreds. It was quite sort of confined, maybe, group of people. Were people we were already working with anyway. And many of them really quite exciting, including, again, one Sharon Kivland.
Yeah, but the open exhibitions, you didn't have to pay a fee to submit your work. No. Most open exhibitions now, when you scroll down at the bottom, said £25, please, pay a bit more, and you can submit 3 works. And, that's common.
Well, it was different times. In fact, I noticed
there wasn't a demand on the artists to subsidise the project.
Yeah, I noticed in one of these leaflets that an admission to a lecture, I can't remember where it is, but
we charged a bit.
It was 50p.
Well, I think it's worth mentioning the selectors that worked with us were Michael Newman, Michael O'Prey, John Stessica, and Liz Wells. We had some, we had some really good people working with us on selection. So I think that challenged us and
it really what it says. Open exhibitions were all over the place at that time, everywhere. But what it does say, I think the kind of, just simply the quality of the names. There are some really very, very serious artists of that time. John Latham. I mean, you can hardly sort of, be more serious than that. Is that Cambridge became a kind of a viable place to show. Not just the Darkroom, not just the Kettles Yard, but Cambridge became a kind of, and that's really interesting because only some years before then, while there were occasionally quite interesting things happening outside these two galleries or what we kind of got going here. For instance, Colin Lumley there present, I remember you showed David Ward in the Reba Gallery here in sort of King's Parade, and that was great, a great sort of project and so on. But it was really a bit of a kind of desert as far as the visual arts go. And by that time, this was maybe, 1986 or something like that, it became a viable place to show Cambridge.
Yes.
I'm just going to ask, to sort of reflect on the later stages of the Darkroom, and and obviously you left at a certain point, Mark. When you handed it over, what were you handing over, and what were the thoughts in your mind, towards the end of that period? Obviously, you were thinking about different things in terms of architecture and so on.
I think I left in 1989, and I think it was 5. I think my sort of tenure included 2 years of sort of pre-gallery sort of development and employment in getting the thing going, and then 5 years as a working director, of which I think Pavel, you were co-direct for the first few years, and then you were sort of freelance, working on different things, working with us. So it was a sort of a world that I kind of fell into, incredibly exciting, dynamic kind of world. But we mentioned the kind of pace, and I think after leaving the Darkroom, I've hardly been to one more private view, because after a private view every month, and then having to sweep up afterwards, it's quite hard work, So there's a sort of intensity of it, a really rich, rich kind of experience. But I think, my kind of is sort of my interests. Sort of, I suppose it's spatial, because architecture. My father's an architect, but I somehow kind of returned to the person I was with then was moving to London to study, sculpture, and I was just thinking it was a point of departure. I think it's like when you feel the energy of something. My regrets are that we didn't get a bigger premise, we didn't make the break with lottery funding and get significant money, but it was a continual struggle to kind of get enough. We were very lucky in that the City Council supported us, the Arts Council supported us, we had significant support from the Gulbenkian Foundation for our education programme. We had a great deal of commitment from the likes of Brian and Roy and other people who supported the organisation. But I think it was a sort of my hopes were that it would continue as an organisation with an energy and a force. But I think at that point, financially, we were kind of doing okay, but as I say, it was a kind of, there were lots of challenges. So I'm afraid to say, I'm rather ashamed. I was just talking to Sharon, because when I left, and I never went back. So I didn't really. I have nothing. I'm having to kind of try and trace what happened after that, but I don't know, because I didn't return. I went into this other world and studying architecture.
But in terms of the title for this event, Radical Art in Cambridge. I mean, I think it's clear to me that there was, an excitement and a sense of possibility through through the making of this institution and the transformations of Kettles Yard.
I suppose it didn't have the backing, the Kettles Yard was implanted with the university, owned its premise. It had the incredible, endowment of Jimmy's, artwork. It sort of lacked that sort of base in terms of its future, and I would like to have given more to that in a way. But you have to turn to others in terms of what happened beyond 89.
I've got one other question which we may not be able to answer very fully, but it's about the Cambridge College of Arts and Technology, and just a sort of an open question really about the Cambridge as a place to sort of study being an artist, and what art students give.
Had a very good foundation course. Yeah, very good foundation course. It's subsequently become angular ruskin, isn't it? I don't know what's happened to it, but at that time we had a very good foundation course. We had very good arts courses in sixth form, like Hills Road sixth form and other schools that we had a very strong relationship. We had our education officer worked with local schools and brought a lot of schools into the gallery and things like that. But
it's just a question because okay, but let's there's one more thread I want to try and address before we open up to questions, which is so radical art in Cambridge. Radicalism takes. We're given this title, and when I look back at these amazing emanations of printed matter and the installation shots of these exhibitions, I have a sense of excitement. But the radicality was in the 1980s context was a peculiar type of radicality because right to buy was setting in. The state was withdrawing. There's high levels of unemployment and
minor strikes with big Thatcherism,
And so the energy of the art scene in that period was the energy of people who still had enough cheap rent and resources to work with, but it was the energy of people without immediate access to power. And I studied through this whole period without realising that there was a radical experimental poetry scene in Cambridge. I was studying right here in the English faculty. I knew nothing about it until later. And it only really started saying hello again during the 1990s when the continuation of the Cambridge Poetry Festival emerged with an event at the Darkroom, the Cambridge Conference for Contemporary Poetry. And it helped me to link up some of what I'd learned from working in the Coracle Bookshop and these connections with other forms of experimental Anglophone writing and how some of those connections had been made with art. So
I think there was a bit of a. I mean, I think the venues being either in the town. When we showed Next Tomorrow, we showed Michael Peel's poster works, and one of the images there is like various sites. There's quite nice. It's got interlinking, through the city, and there was a sort of sense of agitprop of work, with Joe Spence work and others that was a bit. You might consider being directly more political, and certainly an undercurrent of our, position. But I think also Brian would back me up on this. But we're probably thankful for Labour members in Cambridge at that time. I think it was a hung council, but we certainly got critical support in terms of getting the facility, recognising the need for that facility in that part of Cambridge from a very strong Labour contingent. Liz Gard was a local councillor who supported us greatly, and Eastern Arts as well. They supported us.
If certainly in our project, there was something radical. It was not really radical by design. It was radical, may appear to be, or was actually genuinely radical, perhaps, because of some of the work that was being produced then, not locally, but what or not really locally, but what we were interested in and what we brought in. But what made it perhaps seem radical, or what made the effect of it appear radical, was precisely that it was in Cambridge. You bring certain kind of art from London to Cambridge, the art doesn't change, but the impact changes. I do remember when we are talking about the printed matter, Mark, do you remember? Brian definitely will remember, because he had some problems with it. I think that he had to sort of handle or defend there. Do you remember this poster for a show curated by Maureen Bailey called Imposters?
I do, yeah.
Where there was a sort of a silly, really picture. I don't have it here, and I don't know if you have it over there, but it was really a silly work by an artist from East London, whose name I forgot now. I think it was one of Maureen's students or something, who basically posed naked in front of the camera for a self-portrait, covering his private parts with a photograph of Michelangelo's David's private part, you know, as kind of chased the picture as you can possibly imagine. Nevertheless, when the posters were posted in Cambridge, we got, I can't remember if it was the council or some other kind of force here, who kind of came back to us with this can't be done, but you choose, we'll stick black sticker over it, or we'll chop the poster here, and so on. So in Cambridge, showing certain things or certain kinds of art at that time had perhaps a kind of, you know, created more of a sort of critical reaction than you would get somewhere else. And in my mind, it's less important whether the artwork is in some kind of, you know, absolute sort of sense radical or not. What is important is what the art does in its social destination. And its social destination, being Cambridge at that time, you know, was sort of reacting differently than perhaps East London or, you know, the people who came to Camera who were not the local community, but a kind of graduates of London art schools.
Can I say that I think that you did change the work on many occasions by giving it a space to be made, to be produced and to be installed, which often involved the physical change to the building or a move or something, and that was exceptional. Relatively unusual. Really, probably the only other people who did that was Jonathan Harvey at Acme Gallery, a little bit earlier, where artists were trusted, actually, to do something and might come with an idea that could be realised.
Pavel, what you were saying about, you know, the art hasn't changed, but, you know, the context changed the way in which the work was seen. I wonder if I could just ask Simon, as you're here, I mean, the Coracle Press Gallery in Camberwell, South London, on the Camberwell New Road, produced, I don't know how many exhibitions sort of through the 1980s. It's a lot.
Yeah.
And you know, I think, you know, as you're here, it might be interesting to hear your reflections on running a gallery in a sort of a shop premises with very little art infrastructure around and off the street, essentially. So, but doing what you did.
I mean, we were there because the rents were cheap, and no one went south of the river when we started Coracle Camberwell in 1975. You know, it was a complete no-no. I mean, really. But I just wanted to go on a tangent, tell you the story about an Italian dealer called Pietro Sparta, who really admired and loved all the arte povera artists, Cornelius, people like that. So he wanted to make sure he could show these people. He hadn't got a gallery. So he went to Chani in the bowels of Burgundy, and he found a warehouse. And they all came to show at his gallery for the simple reason there was a great restaurant in the town called La Maloise. So you can do anything anywhere, really, if you have a kind of mechanism or a kind of tangent to the way you see it. I don't buy this, you know, I mean, you make Cambridge sound like some backwater.
No, not backwater, but it's a different type of, you know, I use the term social destination. It's not actually mine anyway, but it's a different type of social destination. You know, the social destination, you can say, I don't want to get too philosophical about it, but you can say that artists don't make art. Artists make artworks. You know, art is something that only kind of forms itself from the encounter between the artwork and its audience in a social destination.
There are more factors
and
clearly
so,
than just...
you know, as a social destination, it was certainly different than perhaps East London, where a lot of our sort of artists and supporters came from, or where Sharon was.
But that was only very gradual. It wasn't kind of a blockade of artists coming out of the East End. It was only just beginning to happen about that time. And largely happened because of the 70s, and, you know, performance spaces like David Dawson's in Wapping, you know, these were very isolated places that somehow accumulated into a tendency or a movement out or something like that, you know. But it was very gradual, I think, really, rather than...
Yes, but Cambridge wasn't a backwater, perhaps, or in some way it was, and in other words, it was a sort of, terribly important place, visible through the university, globally, yeah? But it was a place where works of current art, contemporary art, without any special emphasis on the kind of latest or new or anything, just current art which sort of in some kind of way speaks of its own, present times or our times as we live them, function differently and produce something different than they would have produced, and indeed did produce somewhere else, because it's not that these works were quite often, as Sharon reminded us, and I'm really happy to hear that, because I think me and Mark and Brian, we are also proud of it, that we facilitated production of work. And, in quite sort of with light hand, it's not only when you look at the printed programs, it's not only that it's astonishing how many exhibitions we did, but how quickly we did them. There are 3 kind of days missing in the diary. 3 days and the show was done. Mm. I actually remember Sharon's partner, Ron Hazelden, who arrived to install his piece for an exhibition called, whatever it was called, but it was 3 persons exhibition. John Stetzeka and Paul Womble and Ron. And Ron arrived with nothing and said, is there somewhere some kind of, building yard? I need some old doors.
Skip. Yeah.
I need some old doors. So we got him old doors. And the first day there was a kind of a Tatlin-like kind of tower of it built. And the next day he kind of took a electric jigsaw and cut sort of holes in it and so on. And we were ready. And that was it. 2 or 3 days and that was it. So I got myself lost a little bit, but it's not that the work we were showing was not also being shown either before or after or in parallel in other places. It was, but it worked differently here, and I think that's very interesting, and in a kind of way, the context here enabled the work to do something else, than it would have done in some other place. I don't think this is something that we are witnessing now in art, partly because we see more art through the internet and so on, and in kind of like, secondary sort of information than we do in galleries, and partly because I think in the main, the gallery scene, the independent or so-called independent or public gallery scene, has been so kind of institutionalized and professionalized. You have this new institution of the Curator, which didn't really quite exist, or was only emerging then, but certainly, wasn't the kind of thing it is now, and so on. So it was it was just a different situation, not a backwater, but a different situation.
Alina and Lucy gave me a long list of questions, which I haven't managed to ask all of them, but they've. But I'm going to open up now for a few questions here, and to hear some of the knowledge of this period that is in the room right now, and the different light that can shed. So, any questions, please? Yeah.
Simon mentioned printed matter in New York, which was just getting going. I can't remember the exact dates, but it was.
I didn't put a date down.
But the advent of artists.
76.
What?
76.
Was it 76? Thank you. But the advent of artists making books as a work of art rather than be about their art was really formative, I think. And so there seems to me there's something like between the connection of the bookshop at Kettles Yard, which I never saw, so I have no idea, and what was happening, like, were the people at Cambridge Darkroom, was there book activity coming out of that, or were books just something that were somewhere else? I mean, it was an international movement, but did it hit Cambridge? I guess that's what I'm asking. Yeah.
Well, the output of books was, I mean, the catalogues.
No, but I'm talking about books as an
artwork.
art, not a catalog.
No, I mean,
Well, it's a very different
we didn't
thing.
particularly support. We would stock in our sort of reception books like artists have produced, like Thomas Cooper and people, but we didn't. I don't think we directly promoted works.
But I curated an exhibition at Kettles Yard called Turning Over the Pages, which was, it was really Hilary's idea. She came to me with that sort of idea because I, was sort of in the past very interested in precisely in that sort of phenomenon.
I know you were, that's right.
And I think that was, at that time, perhaps not a sort of, didn't necessarily stand out as a sort of important exhibition, but I know that even now it is something that is sort of known in that world of collectors and people who are interested in this sort of thing. And it was a very good thing. You mentioned Ulysses Carrion and his bookshop in Amsterdam. Ulysses came here to do a discussion at Kettles Yard, and I can't really remember everything that happened sort of around it, but it was a very sort of substantial thing. So there was that phenomenon was part of what we were doing, and even though it really, I don't think Kettles Yard, aside from giving Simon the space for the bookshop, were any more directly involved than we were. You can't do everything. And also there's one thing, and the second thing is that really books in any form, including this then new phenomenon, are not really something that is best experienced through a gallery or through an exhibition.
No, but that's what bookshops are essentially.
Yeah.
Because people need to pick
The bookshop was important when it worked. The bookshop was important. But I think for us, we were trying to kind of do the best with what we had, and that was a gallery, that was an exhibition space, and some production facilities for photographic work, and so that may be why the artist books didn't really feature so much in that.
Could I say a few things just from a slightly different perspective? So I teach here at the university, I'm a professor in this faculty, and I was involved with the Darkroom after your time there, so I was the person who was the liaison between King's and the Darkroom when David Ward did his residency here. But I was also involved in 2 residencies at Kettles Yard earlier before that, one with Ian Braithwaite and one with the person's name unfortunately I've forgotten, partly because he tragically took his own life. He was a cellist, he was a musician, or a visual artist. Anyway, so I have considerable experience of the institutions that we've mainly been talking about, but I wanted to make a few remarks. So first thing, it's absolutely wonderful to be reminded of how incredibly active the Darkroom was. So I wasn't here in Cambridge when it started. I moved to Geneva, but I came back in 1986 and then became aware of what was happening and so on, and made connections a bit later when we did a residency in King's. And the thing that I've forgotten is that you have managed to support and showcase contemporary artists in a way which is incredibly vigorous and active, as you've already said, the number of exhibitions and the number of people who came through. But, first observation, when I came back in 1986 and found out that it was here, I lived just around the corner from it, so I lived just on the road. And went to, I can't say went to every show because there are far too many, but I went to a good number of these things that you're seeing here. I'd speak to my students at the time and ask them whether or not they knew about this place and they'd been to any of the shows, and they were completely and utterly unaware of it. And indeed, most of them had not the slightest interest in walking up Mill Road to go and see the exhibition. So I say that partly because there's a curious thing about Cambridge. It goes to what Pavel was saying about in the discussion about whether or not Cambridge is a backwater and what way it might get backwater. In a curious way, Cambridge has, certainly in the time since I've been here, which is from 1976 onwards with a short break in Geneva, Cambridge has failed to support and generate a really active contemporary visual culture scene. The reasons for that, I don't know. I mean, I can certainly suggest some. It might be, one reasonable way of thinking about it, might be the role the university plays in the culture of the city as a whole, and the distinctions or the non-connection between the university and the city. One of the things which I think we stressed in relation to Darkroom is that it is very much a community-based organisation, which is slightly different from Kettles Yard. Kettles Yard is absolutely magnificent, and we're very, very lucky to have it, but it's a very peculiar institution in lots of ways. And not only is it peculiar, it also has a rather uneasy relationship to the university in relation to its funding and so on. So that's one point. Second point, remember that the area that you're talking about, we had something called Eastern Arts. We had something called an Arts Council, and we no longer have that. And the demise of that most certainly must be connected to the strange feature of Cambridge never really developing a supportive and vibrant contemporary visual culture. The third thing to say in relation to this is, remember now, I don't need to say this to most people, and I'm sure, but the culture of the arts that we inhabit now in the UK, especially in relation to the visual arts, is massively different from what it was in the 1980s and certainly 1970s. So you couldn't see any contemporary art in the 1970s or 80s unless you went to a very, very few locales. There were, of course, artists who were alive at the time who had managed to create, and by dint of the value and the interest of their work and luck and all those things which happen with the practicing artist, become public figures, and they may have, then their works may have ended up in national collections. I'm not going to put the names in here. But the people that you were showing, apart from David Hockney, were not people who rose to prominence in that way. And most of the people that you were working with, and indeed that I was working with at the same time or a little bit later, had very, very precarious lives. They made almost no money. In fact, some of the artists who became friends of mine from that period still lived very precarious lives. So one of the things which one needs to put in here is that without a kind of real social, cultural, political supportive network, contemporary artists basically can't do what they do, make art. So one of the incredible things about the Darkroom, and indeed when Mary was at Kettles Yard as well, was to start, these two institutions were not the only ones in the UK, we've already mentioned some of the others, but there began to be a real attempt to support working artists who were not, as it were, at the level of having their pieces in national collections. And amongst those artists, the Darkroom was indeed a place. It was not a backwater. So when I first met David Ward, he excitedly told me that the first place that he had a show, or had pieces shown, was at the Darkroom. And for David, and for people who were in his circle of friends, he's now in his 60s, late 60s, he was about to turn 70 actually. For people in his network, the Darkroom most certainly was a place in the UK landscape of gallery spaces where you could go and get your work shown. So in that way, it was fantastically important. There weren't that many of them. It was fantastically important. But in relation to what it did vis-a-vis Cambridge and the larger Cambridge community, so I'm speaking more from the university side than from the city side, although as a resident in the city for 40-some years, whatever more, I also am completely aware of how it feels, as it were, from the resident side rather than from the university side. The longevity or the support network that came about in the 80s completely failed. So after the Darkroom, I was then the chairman of a short-lived contemporary art space called the Institute of Visual Culture. It also got money from Eastern Arts. It also brought a lot of people from the East End in buses up to Cambridge to see the shows. It had no gallery space to start with, but then in its last 2 years it did have a gallery space, which was right next to the Fitzwilliam Museum. Some of you may have gone to there and visited and seen some of the shows. It had a director who's now the director of the ICA, Stephen Kalmar, and so on. But it had no longevity, partly because Eastern Arts pulled the plug and took the money away, and unfortunately I was the chairman of the board when that happened, so I was partly to blame, or I wasn't really to blame, but nevertheless. I'm telling you this story because it's a part of a longer story about how there seems to me to have been no real purchase in Cambridge as a whole, both university and city, for contemporary arts. And it's a very curious thing. The magnificent thing that you pulled off there in the 80s is one of a number of other initiatives, one with the Institute of Visual Culture. But if we then go back a little bit before that, and we think about, for example, the Poetry Festival has been mentioned, which is much older, it starts in the 70s. Again, that failed after a while, and then it was revived by some colleagues of mine here in the English faculty, and that's when it happened, that's when the thing happened in the Darkroom and so on. But again, in relation to Cambridge being an environment which supports contemporary artists, in this case poets, rather than visual artists, it doesn't seem to work. And probably the best place to look in relation to this about why it doesn't work is the university. It's the university's lack of attention to producing routes for collaborations between and other institutions, providing funding streams and support of one sort or another. That's probably a big part of the story. But there might be some other part of the story which I'm missing out.
Yeah, I'm glad you said it. It seems like things are just one-off excrescences in a way. I mean, you think also that Poetry Festival really was 75, 8 or sort of thing, and so it was way before the time we're talking about. And then I think of another excrescence, which was Form magazine, this amazing magazine run by Stephen Bann, Mike Weaver, and Phil Stedman, which ran to 10 issues, I mean, but then there's nothing in its wake, it just like dies in some way, just another magazine, and things do have their lives, especially magazines, we know that. Like the Darkroom also had its life, it kind of ran out in some way.
For me, what is very interesting about this, what you just said, and blaming or attributing the problem to the university somehow. This is very interesting. I now live in Manchester for 25 years now. Manchester is quite a bit bigger than Cambridge. Anything between, depends what you count as Manchester, but 1.5 to 2.2 million people. And it is actually as poorly, or in terms of kind of support for the production or exhibition of new art by artists who are not necessarily kind of established and so on, it's just as there is just as little of that as there has ever been in Cambridge. But Manchester, like Cambridge, which is not something that is very much in the kind of foreground of our minds, is actually above all a university city these days. It is one of the biggest, the combined campuses are one of the biggest campuses in the world, with about 100,000 undergraduates in Manchester. And I have a feeling, it just is a sort of something that I thought of as I was listening to you, that it may have something to do with both in Cambridge and Manchester, and perhaps in similar places. The university is basically trying to control what passes for culture or social life in general. In Manchester it's incredibly visible. It's visible even in terms of urban planning. For instance, where do you get all the sort of cycle routes and so on? There are areas that nobody in their right mind would cycle because they are far too dangerous, but nevertheless they will build the city will build all the bollards there and lines and so on and street, because it's simply something that the university expects to happen. You know, the real estate, who owns it, who develops it, and so on. So that's on that sort of large, sort of structural sort of level. And when it comes to culture, somehow, you know, the university or universities in Manchester seem to have their own idea of what their clientele, namely students, because let's face it, students are clients these days, above all customers, above all, and education, higher education is above all an industry. So the university seem to have their own idea, you know, of what is expected, and that's what they would kind of fund or support, and anything else, it's just anything else. But because of the weight of the presence of the university in the city, it doesn't really get the kind of space in which it can sort of prosper and develop. You know, maybe you are right, but it's not kind of just Cambridge. It's interesting that my experience of in Manchester, there is no contemporary art scene. There is one quote-unquote independent gallery that used to be great in the 70s. It used to be called Corner House. Now it's sort of many times changed its sort of shape and so on.
Well, you've got the Whitworth. You've got the factory.
Yeah, that's not that's a museum. You have the Fitzwilliam.
They do lots of contemporary art. Come on.
Undo you.
You've shown that.
Well, yes, in a special. Let's call that a special moment. You know, when a very enlightened director, who was a true godsend for Manchester for a short period of time, 4 or 5 years, was sort of trying to shift the kind of balance there. But no, it's seriously, there isn't an independent, there is one independent gallery, which is a kind of, lethargic, sort of tired space, which only exists. And by the way, Andrew, the current director, just leaving us sort of in a few days actually, Ed de Witworth told me over the dinner 2 weeks ago, if Manchester could get away without having a culture, it would. There you go.
Can I, very quickly? I live in rural France. I live at the end of the world. Okay? There is a thriving art scene. It's well supported. There is the Fondation Régionale d'Art Contemporain, which has a fantastic collection, where Catherine Elka, who built that collection, has supported artists in the region for many years. It's now Etienne, got his surname, who came from Brest, this Passerelle. It's a huge, Brittany is a huge, huge province, but there are many spaces. And yes, they close, but places open, and there is a network of artists there. Is it something English?
Absolutely. I'm really glad you said this, Sharon, because I think we can go out from Cambridge just briefly to think about the European context. The Fondation in France, the Kunstverein in Germany. Kunstvereins, they can't do everything, but there's an assumption of devolved government and devolved cultural policy that still is functional in some way. And the attempts to redistribute cultural funding through the 90s, through the lottery, the new galleries that came up then, couldn't actually put in place a firm structure, and now, of course, it's all up for grabs anyway, and being cashiered as we speak. So, but thank you, Andrew, for sort of saying something about Manchester, positive, because obviously I disagree with Pavel as well. Ian.
As unfortunately she isn't able to be here today, I just wanted to pay tribute briefly to Hilary Gresty. I was involved with the Coracle Bookshop at Kettles Yard, and involved in choosing many of the books that were stocked in the bookshop. But going back to the very first point that Sharon made, actually, I was thinking, oh my goodness, I can hardly remember anything about it. But so I thought, what do I do? And I reread the catalogue of the exhibition that Hilary Gresty had curated the year before in 1984, 1965 to 1972, when attitudes became formed. And going back to another point that Sharon made, I thought this was a remarkable exhibition, apart from being a great work of scholarship, re-examining the legacy of all the art of the 60s and 70s. And really those reconsiderations didn't happen again until the end of the 90s, when you got sort of global conceptualism in 1998 up till, let's say, Donna DeSalvo's show at Tate Modern Open Systems in 2005 and everything in between. So it was an amazing kind of reconsideration of the art of that period. But what it was also trying to do was to examine what was this transitional moment in the mid-80s, away from the kind of freedoms that have been talked about tonight and the interdisciplinary and sort of openness of art to again a very restrictive kind of postmodernism that was being based on expressionist painting and so on. And that catalogue was actually sort of trying to analyse that moment as it was happening. And in Victor Bergin's essay, you know, he's looking at what was learned from the art of the 60s and 70s and how that affected the different kinds of postmodernism that might emerge. And of course he's looking at a kind of critical postmodernism about the politics of representation and so on. So it's but that at the time was, you know, that exhibition that seemed to be very historical, and I think it was rather ignored at the time. People thought, oh, why are you dredging up all these yesterday's artists? In fact, it was a kind of pretext for really putting out there a really important discussion about exactly the kind of projects that were happening at the Cambridge Darkroom and elsewhere. And then, you know, so it was very prescient, but also Hilary then invited Simon to make the bookshop at Kettles Yard, which was quite a courageous thing to do in terms of the context, as we know, of the university at the time, but felt very threatened by interdisciplinary studies, the sort of sullying of the purity of separate disciplines. I remember, because I'd been an undergraduate a little bit earlier, the non-renewal of the tenure of Colin McCabe, who had dared to introduce French theory and media studies into the study of English literature, and that was not supported. Yeah, and I think that going back to Erica's point, Hilary recognised that what was so one of the most a very significant medium for artists was the artist's book, and it hasn't really ever been fully recognised, or it certainly wasn't at the time, that the artist's book was actually an artist's medium that was using very often photography and text together or separately, that was available to the public in a different way from the experience of going into a gallery. So potentially it had this very sort of democratic distribution.
Absolutely agree that Hilary can't be tonight, which is and I think to add something to what you've said about when attitudes became form, that is so important in the exhibition. I think Hilary had very, very good judgment about the emerging social agendas within the art world and the politics of representation. So if we as part of this, I hope, ongoing project, to just actually see the list of exhibitions there and to see the way in which she used, she worked with and gave opportunities to younger artists to see their work in the way that they did. And so I think alongside the sort of historical and formal questions, she opened up a space of representation for social issues to be seen in a different way than in the documentary tradition. But there was an implicit social and political agenda in some of her choices, I think. But Andrew, please. I'm
allowed to add to the recollections, but it's kind of difficult when you were there because you're half thinking of recollections and you're half thinking is there some sort of objective analysis. But it's very interesting what everyone's been saying. I mean, my memory was working at Kettles Yard in 1984 was very much that Kettles Yard and Hilary absolutely appreciated the Darkroom. It was like having another sort of intelligent place that we could kind of work with. But also, I mean, as I said, the art world was so small in those days was so different that it was almost radical by default. You know, either you, particularly the network we were kind of in, the network or the kind of, if you like, the kind of cult or club that I joined as a young curator. And I suppose I learned a lot from Hilary because we did this show when Attitudes became form, and there was a bit of a question about doing it so soon after it only just happened. You know, it just been in '69, so it actually felt quite soon in '84. But it meant that there was a sort of sense of a kind of critical discourse, and your point about, Ian, about politics of representation was very powerful at that time, and a feeling that across town at the Cambridge Darkroom, similar discussions were kind of happening. And I think the Cambridge Darkroom opened at such an interesting moment in relation to the photographic sort of medium, because although you'd had the breakthroughs of the sort of 69 to 72 generation, and it did include, of course, photography, video, actually it hadn't gone far enough, it hadn't really sort of got there. And I think when you hit, no one sort of said there's no reason to in a way, but when you hit the sort of Damien Hirst generation of Frieze in '88, it threw a massive sort of shadow backwards. You know, almost everybody who was kind of interesting just before. If you look at the kind of ICA books they did about sort of French theory in kind of '87, '88. I mean, I do remember walking around the ICA going, if anyone else puts Lacan in their title, I'm going to go crazy. You know, there was a lot of that going on before Frieze hit. But Frieze happened to the exhibition in '88. There was obviously a big opening up of the art world. The market went kind of crazy as well. And somehow there was this sort of shadow in British contemporary art of all of the interesting, radical, politically motivated, socially motivated, not caring whether they had a private dealer kind of culture, of which Kettles Yard and the Darkroom were part, was all sort of in a bit of a shadow. So it's kind of great to be talking about some of it. And I think, I must say, on the word about being radical, in one way I think it is radical, and it raises the question to someone like me, still running Kettles Yard now, or anyone, is we're doing 3 main exhibitions a year, not 8. We're doing, as it happens, we did do quite a lot of events when we reopened a few years ago, but we are doing less events as well. But it does mean the opportunities to support emerging artists and to sort of make them feel as though you could be a home for them is really hard now. And a couple of things I noticed on here that really, I mean, I'm always trying to hold on to this kind of thing in my mind as we're thinking about the future and trying to hold on to it. But I like, as you were saying, I think, well, there's a staircase display space, or something. It says the sort of staircase display, and you've got, in fact, Edward Wright was in the staircase display. And in those days, you know, artists were very happy to be in corridors and staircases because there was only a very small network, and being part of it was part of it. And I think these big open shows were a very good move for the Darkroom and for Kettles Yard, but they were also massively appreciated. And somewhere in those slides, and I have a very clear memory of this actually when I was up in Glasgow too. I mean, Monaghan too did her time. I mean, I can remember Monaghan too in numerous kind of low-scale, cheaply put together group shows. She was like this kind of radical kind of political artist. No one in a million years at that time would have thought she was going to become a global art world figure. I mean, it just would have seemed inconceivable. I'm not quite sure why we didn't, but you just didn't. She was kind of part of the team. She was part of the kind of culture, like you, Sharon, part of the culture of intelligent, smart artists doing interesting things. And if you had a little bit of public money, you showed them. They were kind of part of the family. You tried to kind of show them. So it was a very, you know, no tape model, no internet. It was a very different sort of scene. And I think, again, on this sort of question of radical, it feels a little bit like the audiences were so, I was just saying to Ian, we'd be still preparing exhibitions at Kettles Yard and putting up the work 10 minutes before the opening. The opening was basically 25, 30 people coming in with a glass of wine, most of whom were family and friends, not quite. So it was very, I mean, you know, obviously you should have thought we should have pushed for more audiences, but in small audiences it's like a sort of circuit which in a way allowed a kind of critical culture and a sort of freedom of focusing on art, you know, primarily on art that kind of was nothing to do with the market. It was kind of to do with having some kind of critical endeavour within an idea around the importance of kind of visual culture. Yeah, the Cambridge Darkroom was, I'm putting here sort of, there's a sense of always being in battle, very little funding, tiny staff, but also a very supportive kind of culture. I mean, I put here contemporary art was a backwater. I mean, it wasn't totally a backwater if you got a hold of a copy of Art Forum, you felt part of a pretty big thing. Obviously there were big museums, but I can remember when Tape Britain, as was the Tape, used to do a contemporary show, and Greville, you'll remember this, it was kind of exciting. You know, there was one they did called, there was Michael Compton's New Art in '84, there was another one called 7 Artists with Marlene Dumas in about '86, and it was like, oh, well, that's the first show they've done of New Art for about 4 years at the Tape. I mean, it's something conceivable now. So, you know, it was exciting because you felt you were doing something valuable within quite a small network, quite a few small galleries around the country. But to have 2 spaces in Cambridge for a period of years, with very smart people running them, thinking and working with a sort of frame of exciting and interesting kind of emerging artists as well was kind of great. And I think for people like me and anyone who's still involved in the visual arts, we have to kind of absolutely try and hold on to some sense of kind of, we try to, but you know, try and hold on to kind of why art matters and its kind of position and what it can do, and not allow everything else to kind of smother it. So I'm making a massive speech now. But anyway, Cambridge Darkroom, yeah, fantastic to be talking about it, and it was a good moment. One final thought on the question of the university. Yes, of course, gentlemen, yes, sorry, yes, I mean, the university, what can I say? Obviously, I feel they should support Kettles Yard more, they should support the visual arts more. It's a very literary university. I mean, here we are in the English department. It's very focused on peer-reviewed written papers. You know, we're still trying to point out that the ref does cover a lot of other kinds of outcomes and outputs. But I think the other thing to say is when we did a show with Gustav Metzger a few years ago, he did one of his early performances in Cambridge, like in '58 or something. And there is something about doing something in this kind of intellectual aura of Cambridge, which has, don't you think, I kind of feel like with the Darkroom, there would have been a sort of sense of, without sounding arrogant about people in Cambridge generally or sort of overplaying it, of a kind of active, intelligent, kind of general sort of sense of a kind of active culture in Cambridge, and that there were people who were likely to be interested, and the Darkroom and Kettles Yard were part of this kind of critical discourse. I mean, maybe I'm being too idealistic. So I sort of feel like yeah.
There were certainly people who were interested, but it just sort of struck me that if, again, I also don't know your name, but...
My name is Peter Ball.
Thank you. You know, if you sort of attributed what you perceive as the kind of lethargy or sort of lack of interest or whatever to the university, or if you think that it may have something to do with the university dominating, if you like, the kind of self-image of Cambridge. I have the same experience, or very similar experience, from a big city with completely different history, completely different ethnic or social mix and so on, than here. But one thing is the same, is dominated by the university, you know? Maybe it's just a coincidence, but I think it's an interesting observation.
We should perhaps just mention Ivan Gaskell, who was our chair for some last few years, who was a Cambridge academic and a strong connection with the university. And interesting you mentioned Eastern Arts, because one of our key supporters was Jane Heath, who backed us and fought for funding for us over consecutive years.
I think we're about at the end. We've started a lot of conversations here but not finished them. We haven't got to the questions really of what quite wasn't possible at this time, but there's further to go with this, and I think there'll probably be other discussions to have in future. But stick around if you want to chat more, or if it. But thanks very much, and thank you all to all of our panelists.
Thank you, both of you.
Yeah, well done.